Hello and welcome to another modelling video. This is Alan from the Mokonoman at YouTube with another model review. We're going to be looking back at our Royal Max airbrush compressor review, which is the most viewed video I've ever made and has attracted many modelers as well as other hobbyists from various disciplines, skills and output. Most of them very new to the art of airbrushing and being settled in on their first machine to see if they wish to expand or not. The airbrush that comes with it is a standard 0.3mm double action gravity feed Hseng airbrush. It is a very standard airbrush. It is manufactured in multiple countries and factories under many different names, and one of the oldest patent airbrushes that is in existence from Japan. It started life off as an Olympus, eventually being bought out by Iwata. Now, the interesting thing about this airbrush is it is output to many different makes of airbrushes of a higher brand such as Iwata or Badger, and you'll be familiar with its design in their marketing material instructions and outputs. I can assure you the majority of these come from the same factory, so instead of a nice container you can buy it from the cheapest source. There are some variants where they can open near the nozzle end, as well as other gimmicks like a adjustable cup. I have gone to effort in reviewing them, pulling them apart and testing each of them to various results. In the end, I always come back to this pattern, and it's the pattern that I've learnt through the Sparmax brand, and it's the pattern I'll always stick to. To help you guys out, we're going to review this as the base model to compare all other airbrushes. I haven't done it to this date because I assumed many would be familiar from the use of many of my old videos, testing and maintenance videos. See this as a gateway video to a lot of my other airbrush content, and you'll have an idea of how to pull it apart, maintain it, use it and its basic applications. Hope this is informative and helpful. There is a very common saying from Russia that there is a quality in quantity, and sometimes that quantity is best if there is enough quality there to cover the base job. The airbrush comes in various cases from various labels on the side. I find the plastic one does crack, break down, and it is just excessive plastic that you're going to throw out. The cardboard is a lot cheaper. This is the very model I sell through my online hobby shop, the Salt Mine Hobbies, and I've parted with many of these. Get a nice bubble wrap, and it comes in absolute fine condition. I would actually recommend anyone starting out to buy a couple of these, 2 minimum. If you're into polyurethanes such as Vallejo, AK, all that, even more, you'd have one only for that, and you'd only clean it with water detergent. Everything else you can use solvents, as to prefer not to build up jelly inside, and it's virtually unusable without a full ultrasonic clean. One of the first things you'll do is buy spare needles and nozzles from the same source, very cheaply, Amazon, eBay, Salt Mine hobby shops, and get 0.5, swap it to that. It will be so much easier to use as a beginner modeler. Inside is a 0.3. People who've been airbrushing and in the modeling industry for a long time and downgrading from their more expensive airbrushes or picking up something new will still get the hang out of that size, though everything is so much cheaper with 0.5. We'll be using what's already here for our tests and review, as it is just an out of the box without any further modification. So we've already got our airbrush. This is pretty much useless, and after some solvent use will disintegrate. Our eyedropper, and we have a nozzle wrench, which is very important. Please retain, do not lose, little baggie or parts box. Now, one thing that does confuse people immediately when they get that is the input. The input of air is 1/8 inch thread. You get a hose. You can add that to a hobby compressor, which they're all 1/8 H, especially from Asia. The only difference is Badger, but within their own catalogue of hoses, airbrushes and whatnot do come with adapters, so we don't have to worry about that. You attach a hose, you add air pressure, you're ready to go. How they can vary it in airbrushes is they may have different ends. You could have an adjustable rear piece, which looks something like this. Ignore the colour, and you're able to adjust the back by how far the needle can stick backwards and forwards in getting a predetermined spray pattern like a single action airbrush. You're going to hear a lot of terms such as single and double action airbrushes. A single airbrush is when you just push the trigger down and it sprays a mixture of paint and air. Double action is where you get variation by pulling backwards and getting a small to a large pattern. A gravity feed is self-explanatory. The paint goes down, it's not siphoning from underneath or the side. Anything that siphons does give you a whole extra level of issues and difficulties. This part uses rubber hoses for some very, very cheap compressors. This causes problems. The first thing to do is remove that and absolutely ignore it. The one thing that's very important for all airbrushes is the study of the instructions, most importantly the parts catalogue and the parts. Generally, when you buy an airbrush, the most common thing to buy is the needle and nozzle that's readily available. After that, a pack of rubber O-rings for various points that will wear out over time, especially if you decide to have regular baths in thinner or corrosives or use a corrosive paint. As we were only paying anywhere around the 20 USD mark, and if you get a few years out of it deciding to replace it, a bunch of O-rings will cost the same. Buying a whole new airbrush is actually quite affordable, getting a lot more out of it. The rest of it will give you very generic instructions as well as the specifications of your airbrush. The parts breakdown generally breaks down in far more parts than is actually necessary for maintenance. It's just a diagram for engineering assembly, and we've got the internals, which is more useful for our understanding. If you do lose these, the picture is very common and the first thing that appears when you look up for diagram or airbrushing on Google. So generally, this is your first airbrush. You've ruined one and it's your second one, yet your first experience, or wish to learn more about it to be more efficient with its use. It is good to be familiar with the factory reset at its core value straight out of the box, how it has a beautiful use straight away, and reverting back to that factory reset through cleaning and maintaining. There is a few things to note out for, but the very first thing, like buying anything mechanical that you are going to maintain, is how to disassemble it and reassemble it. And the first thing I always recommend everyone to do is to pull it apart and put it back together multiple times. And the order that I'm going to show you in this video is the best way to go around it. You can also follow at home. Once we've removed the back, we've got the needle nut. Now this pinches the back assembly, so we're able to pull the needle in and out multiple times. The needle is one of the two parts that are very important and very, very easy to break. We've got the tip. If you drop it, it will bend. If you bend it, break it, it's not going to atomize and spray as nice. If you bend the tip, you can catch it with your knife, straighten it out, or break it. And if it's a bit too thick, you can hone it by getting a bit of sandpaper and running it across while rotating it to re-get that tip. Now some people go as far as improving these airbrushes by polishing it with polish and fine grit sandpaper. It is something you do not have to be afraid of. Getting into the assembly, and this is important not to lose any parts and return it to how we found it, we continually twist this outer sheath that has a long thread until it comes out. We pinch the back end and we already have these three parts: the outer shroud, the spring, and the back of the trigger mechanism. Now getting back to it, we're going to pull out the trigger. The trigger can come in multiple forms depending on what factory they come out of. Earlier models will have the air trigger completely separated from the upper trigger. This can be very difficult to replace. This one with a swivel does take a bit of getting used to in putting back in, but you're not losing any tiny brass pieces, as well as the trigger tongue, which is very tricky to put back in. It'll take quite a bit of practice, but once you pulled it apart and put it back together multiple times, you will get very, very quick. It's better to get familiar with that before you start to struggle and get flustered when you're doing maintenance work. Now, a very important part to consider, especially if you're going to give it thinner or ultrasonic baths, is there is an O-ring around this part. Now on the inside there is a brass shroud that's connected by a screw. You do not ever have to remove that, but sticking a fine electrical screwdriver all the way through, you will find a brass nut that has a flat end groove and a hole all the way through. This threads into the very back just before the paint cup chamber, and it will keep a Teflon white O-ring. It is possible to change this O-ring and buy a new one. If you have a more expensive airbrush of the same pattern as this, replacing that O-ring, even out of one of these cheaper airbrushes, is possible. If you've just bought one of these for about $20, a little less, a little more, you can just buy another airbrush. It's something that exists. There is a video on how to replace it on this channel, but it's good to be familiar because over time that breaks down. By lubricating the back end, you will prevent paint penetrating from this part into the back end. It's generally good form. Whenever there's liquids here, you never ever remove the needle, as everything will travel back. It'll get sticky, it'll ruin the airbrush. You have to pull it apart and do a very thorough clean just to get it into some sort of semblance of operation and use. It is a mistake you come across. It will require a full soak, but being very vigilant about that part, taking your time, being slow, thinking about it, you will not make any major mistakes. We can work at the front end. This is the crown. It can come in two parts. You can remove the top bits and do some very, very fine spraying airbrush work. And this is our nozzle. We've just made a nozzle maintenance repair video and went into a great amount of detail. With the wrench, we do a quarter turn to remove it, and we have a completely naked airbrush. You can change, as I recommend, the nozzle and the needle to a 0.5. Now when we're doing maintenance and we pull it down to this point, we can scrub it down. You can buy this tool, which is a bottle brush set to scrub the insides and other parts. I also recommend putting the rear end of your needle through and just unblocking any debris that will come out of the size of an ant or smaller that will block your nozzle. Most cleaning and maintenance will occur around this region. After everything is pulled apart, now we can put it all back together and lubricate it in efforts to maintain. This is our air solenoid. Just a bit of tip of maintenance, that it is spring loaded, and you can see your finger that it flows pretty easily. When it pushes in, it allows air to pass 2 holes here. When it's closed, it absolutely stops air. And how that works is that we've got 2 O-rings there, a pipe that goes through. When it's pushed, it allows air to pass, and there's a spring inside. It comes apart in 4 components, which is the outer shell, a little donut nut that screws right into the shell, a brass pin with 2 O-rings, and a screw. If you do decide to pull it apart out of interest, there are 2 cutaways that will look like that. We've got the hole for the brass bit to pass, and these 2 holes for air. You're able to get tweezers, stick it in those holes, and screw it out until it opens into those 4 parts. To pull it apart, clean it, put it back together. Just a bit of a soak in case, as I explained, you pulled the needle out and paint has flooded into this part. This part can also be bought or replaced, but it's just interesting to pull it apart and be familiar with it. So being done with that, we screw it in. The first part that I always like to deal with is the front end, once we've cleaned out around there and in there. If you're soaking it, the O-rings will have a certain lifespan of 1 year to 2 years, soaking it about half a dozen to a dozen times a year. If you choose not to soak it in harsh solvents like turpentine or lacquer thinner, depending on the type of paint you use, it's polyurethane, it's water-based, you're only doing water or detergent water, it will pretty much last forever. So we're going to screw in the nozzle. It goes in very, very lightly. We get our spanner, and the trick with this is, because it is wafer thin metal, it's a micron to 2, it will shear easily. You only want the pressure of 1 finger, and you just put the slightest amount of force. You don't want to overturn it because you will shear the thread off, it will fall off, it will be a pain. If you do that, we do have a video looking into how to repair a broken nozzle. Now sometimes the O-ring can fail. To get better atomization, fine amount of beeswax or something that forms a skin applied over that seal will improve its performance. It is very worthwhile to experiment without fear of failure. Next, we put on the crown. Putting the rest of it together, I like to use lubrication. Metal on metal will wear out, it will get stuck. The slightest molecule or any sort of paint or fluids passing will make metal stick together, and it's not going to work well at all. Utilizing a lubricant, you can buy proper professional airbrush lubricants and seals. They have a high velocity. People do say they're made for certain purposes, not to contaminate, cause problems. I've just used petroleum jelly for the past several years, never had a problem, do quite decent work without adhesion problems. We're also going to use a Q-tip, and all you want to do is lightly build it up, and we're glazing the internals. So right inside the back, we're just glazing our threads, and we're putting a build up right where the rear seal is that we've talked about, as well as a little bit inside the chamber and on the O-ring for the air trigger. Also coating all of our threads and O-rings in petroleum jelly. They will not dry out as easily. It also gives them a barrier when we soak them when we clean them or use very heavy solvent paints. I'm almost exclusively a lacquer airbrush individual. That is the nastiest paint you can possibly use. It's automotive car paint. It does not do much of a toll, and you're able to flush it, soak it, everything you need for many years to come. And as they wear out, you put a bigger build-up of Vaseline, and it does an absolute treat. Now we've got our trigger here, and just the lightest glaze on our brass bit. If it's too heavy, it's going to struggle, get stuck. You'll have to wipe off the excess, pull it apart, put it back together. The first thing I like to do is add the tongue, and we add it right through the front there. Once you want to add the S, where the tip of it is resting on the very back of the hole, and it's going in like an S shape, where the back trigger rests on the rounded bit facing out. So a lot like that. This can be very tricky. It'll take you time to master. You put it in sideways, twist it 90 degrees, and make sure it's resting there. Utilizing the back of your needle, you're able to help position it in. The next step is our trigger. It's going to constantly bend. You want to look right in and slide it straight into the O-ring. It will have a habit of just falling straight in, swivel point, and it will sit like that. That is absolutely no good. Balancing the tongue as well as the trigger sticking right into the air valve is very tricky. I normally have no problems doing it by myself. For some reason on camera I get a bit shy, and it has all sorts of problems. Once it glides right in, you'll notice once you press down, it just springs straight up, and it works perfectly fine. At this point we have a really good harmony. We don't want to cause any problems. Just sit it straight down. It's interesting to see how the surface trigger does connect to the bottom air valve, and it's all touching each other. Now this is the assembly, so the tongue can push the trigger back. That pinches the needle and actually pull the needle back as well. This bit can get sticky very easily if paint or anything runs through it, and definitely could use a glazing. When you're doing maintenance, you're pulling it apart, you're cleaning the paint cup nozzle end, and you're looking at the rear end. You can see if the lubricant is changing colour. Once it starts going to a dark grey, a black, it means paint is seeping in. It starts to dry out because lacquers and thinners does have a habit of doing that on lube. It's time to clean it out, give it a good scrub, a good soak, and a wipe down, and a re-lube once completely dry. We're going to add lubricant in the inside of this part. You stick the spring in, and this part goes all the way through where you pull back, and it has motion as well as a lot of resistance that it shoots out. At this point we pick up our airbrush, and to be very careful, we put the trigger in, we get the threads to bite, push this all the way so the trigger and the tongue is facing up, and we keep screwing in until it hits the back with this model. Other airbrushes you don't want to do that, but that is not our problem today. We're only getting used to tuning the Hseng 30. Now to make sure it's all working, you can push down, springs up, no problems. It pulls back, and you can see this bit pulling backwards as well. This is the factory ultimate, perfectly operational It feels very, very smooth with the lubricant. It's not juddering, getting stuck or causing any problems. And we're able to put the needle in, making sure when the trigger's gone in, the hole is facing frontwards so the needle can pass on. If you're unconfident, put it in backwards first to make sure it doesn't get stuck anywhere. If there's any problems, it's facing any resistance, you don't force it, you will damage the tip. I can feel it's going almost all the way in the end. Everything is nicely aligned. Let's put in the tip and we slowly guide it in, and to make sure that it is working very well. You can see that the needle is sticking out about 1 mil from the nozzle. That is a healthy distance. Sometimes you get debris in the nozzle and it doesn't poke out all the way through. That's when it definitely needs a clean out or maintenance. Pushing it further may tear the nozzle, it may bend the needle. We do not put any force into anything, but that will take time and you'll make mistakes where parts are easy to get and cheap. Buy multiples, buy plenty, and you'll have no problems getting familiar. Don't be afraid to test, play, pull it apart, put it back together, and really learn this beast. Whenever we put the crown in, we pull the needle slightly out so we're not bending it when we're putting this back on. To seat the airbrush needle, which is a term, you push it until it reaches the top. We'll find out if the seal is really good by putting fluids in the airbrush. Last part is the needle nut. It goes on, pinches the rear trigger onto the needle, and when you pull back, the whole assembly goes backwards and forwards, followed lastly by the rear part. If you drop it like so, you can damage it quite severely, so it is protection even though we don't have a mechanism in the back to halt the needle. We're going to flush this out with thinner, and we shall paint some lines to see how it's all going. Common goal with airbrushing when we're testing it, we're going to fill it up with thinner to make sure that the seal of the nozzle is perfectly fine and does not cause us any issues whatsoever. If any air gets in before the end of the nozzle, it's going to escape in and bubble out of the cup, causing a huge drop in pressure. Any airbrushes that can pull apart past the nozzle and requires an O-ring should not be pulled apart there unless absolutely necessary for repairs or replacement of parts, probably 1 or 2 times in the life of the airbrush. More high-end airbrushes with Teflon O-rings and very long threads are okay. With things of this quality, not so much. So if the airbrush can break around here, generally just don't buy it. This is the perfect pattern and appearance to get. Doesn't matter if the end is completely different, the color's different, the shape is slightly different, or the cup is removable for a larger plastic vessel. The important thing is nothing is pull apartable from this point to this point. In cleaning out the cavity there, we saw it when completely pulled apart. Taking the nozzle out is not an issue whatsoever. Once we put the paint in, it also checks for that to make sure it's not spluttering, causing problems, very, very low pressure. But if the needle is seated absolutely properly, the nozzle's not torn or damaged, and we're going to paint really, really fine lines, as thin as a pen or pencil mark as humanly possible, and we'll do some gradient sprays of light dust for building up of paint, not blasting on very thick coats of paint, which is not the purpose of an airbrush. We're going to achieve all sorts of different interesting effects through dry layers of paint or very, very thin lines. This one can't do those two the best at all, but it does a pretty decent job once modified to the point of performing quite well. that's where a more inexpensive airbrush comes into play. They offer 0.5 nozzle. You can colour things in very, very efficiently. Even though an airbrush might have a moisture trap at the end of it, this is a moisture filter. We talk about it more. It improves the performance of your airbrush significantly in filtering all oils or vapors entering your airbrush. This attaches by the 1/8 thread right at the bottom there, and we have the input of air. We turn on the compressor, we build it up to between 11 to 15 psi, which is ideal for spraying lines or dusting on. Now in the cup, we're going to spray some lacquer thinner. This is going to help us spray any lubricant or oil that's stuck in there. Pushing down, if we have any bubbles whatsoever, that means there's a seal break. It's absolutely tight, we've done well. And we pull back. Thinner is actually spraying out, and there is no bubbles as well. It works out quite well. Now, when you're cleaning an airbrush, you wipe out and you remove as much paint as humanly possible. Paint has got a way of being stuck in all sorts of nooks and crannies. To do a really good flush, you put your finger really tight at the end of the crown there, push down, and you push back slightly, and it bubbles quite a bit. It's mixing everything. It's also good for mixing paint. A stand is very useful in it not falling apart, and you can store it to pour paints and thinners, and you can also spray and filter out your fumes pretty efficiently. And that is the cup, absolutely empty. Now we're going to put paint in next. It is highly recommended that you mix your paint externally in a cup or something, equal part paint and thinner, to the consistency of milk. Normal paint would be about the consistency of putty or cream milk. What you want to do is put it in a glass container, swish it around. When it hits the side of the surface, it will completely drain back to the main pool. It's overly thinned. If it coats the side of the glass or plastic, it pretty much is too thick. So we've got some paint here. We're going to swirl it significantly, and you can see that it coats it, but it's starting to retract a bit. This is probably overly a little too thick, so we're going to thin it down a bit more. Mix it sufficiently, swish it, and you can see it's starting to come back and become transparent. I can see my finger through it. This is the perfect consistency of paint to go through anywhere between 0.2 to 0.5, including 0.3. We pour it in, we have a look inside, finger against, mix it a bit, and absolute perfection. Also consider airbrushes quite hazardous to the health. It creates vapor of thinner and paint. Doing it outdoors, a vac filter that pumps the fumes out of your confined workspace. A filter doing it outside all works. I'm only doing it very quickly to review and talk in a fairly quiet environment. Most other times I'm masked up. I've got an extractor booth going. Now, when we spray, as soon as you push your finger down, majority of there just busts out. Sometimes paint builds up in the crown. It's going to have a very, very ugly splat, and it's going to have chunks of paint, dirt and crud just land on your work. The first thing you always do is you spray off any surface that you're spraying. You hold it down, you're spraying air constantly, you have a considerable amount of pressure, and then you pull back and you've got paint coming out. The gradient is ever so slightly spluttery. It's brand spanking new. We can do a few more finer touches, thin the paint a little further, and we're fine. We want to start with the absolute finest line. As the very first line out of the airbrush, that is an amazing indication. We're going to go right to 15 psi, nice and close. We rock it back, and we're going to do a really fine line, and we shall repeat that a few times. This is actually now working absolutely perfectly. This is the ideal output we want, even out of high-end airbrushes. With the little amount of work we've done, we've turned this very cheap $10, $20 airbrush into a machine that is working as well as majority of the high-end stuff. So when people talk about brand wars or fighting or whatnot, your understanding of the airbrush and how quickly you can clean it and reset it up, and your experience is pretty much the most important thing. Now, pulling back, we're going to do a much larger line, and you can see from the tight ones, it's a very tight line. It's what we call a hard edge. Pulling it back, that's a very soft gradient edge, and you can also do fine shading and build up from nothing to a build up of color with experience. Now, painting on paper is a porous surface to something that's absolutely unporous, unprimed or primed plastic. That's a different experience. It requires a softer approach of building up paint as it can run. It's going to sit on it on a liquid state until it hardens into a solid state. This business just absorbs into the paper. So generally the experience to get a nice coat in this, like what I did that, you pull back about 10 to 15 centimeters and you dust on when it's transparent, and you build up, remembering that you start spraying off, on, and you spray, so you're not getting spluttering. We're going to splutter. You can see that there's a few speckles of paint that's appeared, and it's not pretty. It builds up on the rim and it just launches straight on. It does not look good at all, so you always start spraying off, on, back, build up. Spray off, on, build up. And you do that until it's absolutely solid of a color. It's not pooling, it's not dripping. If you hold in one spot and you build up, you can see that it starts to cause all sorts of problems. It's pooled, it's uneven, it's strong in some parts, it's weak in other parts. Where here, that's the ideal way of colouring in a hard surface. So that is all the spraying that we're getting used to, and you can experiment with masking techniques, all that. This is the core abilities you should expect out of any airbrush. This is the cheapest one. This is the performance. You'll get the same performance out of everything else unless you want a tiny line. Now, paint can be reclaimed depending on its chemical classification. I'll just put that straight back in because it's lacquer. Anything acrylic you should probably pull apart or pour out or dispose of ethically. Going to wipe out the cup and the body with a tissue, dry. The second wiping with a tissue has a few drops of thinner, and you're able to get all the paint off the facade and inside the cup. You make sure you spray all the paint out, and we're going to take out the needle and give that a click wipe down. You can see that there's a build-up of paint, bit of a wipe, and straight back in there. That's every time we change colours, so you don't have any remnants of paint in there to cross-contaminate change the colour. We're just going to put the tiniest amount of thinner to coat the bottom. There you go. Put your finger, jet bubble, and you spray out. This is flush number 2, and you can see that the remnant of the colour is becoming more diluted. With a Q-tip or a corner of tissue, you hold the needle back and you wipe out the crown to get it nice and clean. That's where paint builds up, it sprays onto surfaces, causes all sorts of problems. If you're spraying for the same colour for a very long period of time and refilling the cup, clean that bit out regularly as so you don't get huge lumps and it sprays everywhere. Clear coats and primers can be a huge issue, especially paints that are quick to dry out. This is our 3rd flush, and you can tell that the colour is practically non-existent. And one more for good measure. There is not a hint of colour. We can just pour that out, and we've got a perfectly cleaned airbrush that we can put straight into storage. We turn off our airbrush. It's courtesy to clear out anything that's in the water trap and water trap. Turn it off. Drain all the air as to make sure there's no build up to make any seals wear out. And when you turn on the compressor, if it's full of air, it's going to damage the O-rings in the pistons. If it's absolutely free of air or got a way to bleed out, it's also not retaining moisture, and it's not going to cause damage. It's just good courtesy to make sure your electrical appliance, the most expensive part of the rig, put all your money into the compressor to make sure that it will last you a long time, especially if you've got the cheaper Royal Max 1. If you want to have more control over pressure and a larger tank so you can spray longer and do higher pressure stuff, gradients, that would be the time that you decide you really like the airbrush hobby, you want to expand and invest in more. A bigger, better, more powerful compressor is next step once you're ready for that. Here are the spray patterns. We'll have a close look, and you can see that they're fairly smooth. But the very first ones does get spluttery, but with getting used to it and adjusting, first time it's always like that to get all the burrs and whatnot from the manufacturing process out of your system. Your airbrush is electroplated brass, and electroplating will wear out. You know that you're definitely at the end of the life, even though you replaced O-rings. Once the internals start to wear out and it's all gold, the paint will stick inside all the nooks and crannies a lot easier. It's going to be super hard to clean. At that part, it's time to say goodbye to the main body and toss it out. The electroplating can corrode very quickly with salts being stored in liquids, being soaked in fluids for far too long, or being cleaned out with bleach. Bleach is excellent for lifting paint off plastic and models and stuff. Not so good for O-rings, and this sort of surface will absolutely ruin the body. Now, in the end, this is your tutorial airbrush. It is your first airbrush. This is as much information as I can throw at you, as well as what to look out for. Be very familiar with the body when you are shopping, and just make sure that from the instructions, tutorials, reviews, it does not come apart here, and that the paint container is on top. It's double action. It's not very hard to maintain, clean, look after. All the information you need to start operating has been demonstrated to you with this video. The more you use it, the better you get at it. The more you pull it apart, the more you flush out paints. Don't be afraid of failure. If you can afford it, buy multiples of these bad boys. Have a look at the 0.5 and just spray, have fun. Look, as many tutorials and tips and tricks as you can find out there. There's a whole world of different ways to airbrushing. Everyone has a different method, from selecting, pulling apart, putting back together, cleaning up, maintaining, all that. But I'm of the belief of the quicker you can do it, the better it probably is for you. In conclusion, I hope this helped you out when you're reviewing, looking, exploring other airbrushes. You're looking at the reviews, you're pulling it apart, you're testing it. You're either going to find that it's exactly the same as this guy, a few advantages that make it worse, a few advantages that make it better, or it's completely alien and different and that still does the exact same task. But there should be no barriers for you to get into airbrushing, and realistically, with how cheap they are on the markets, just jump straight into it, have fun, embrace it. There's nothing to fear. Thank you very much for watching. As always, until next time, stay tuned for further content. If this is your first or second video to this channel about airbrushing, you looked at a compressor reviewer like the Royal Max, and then you explored this for everything you need to know about your first time, I have a playlist called Honing Your Airbrush Skills, where it's just a vlog of my airbrush development, testing it with soaking, ultrasonic cleaning, maintaining it in different ways, trying out different methods on old broken airbrushes and new airbrushes, testing and reviewing every airbrush under the sun that I can humanly come across, including accessories and just other products in general, as well as paint. It's something I haven't uploaded for a while. I probably don't soak or ultrasonic clean as often as I used to, but just putting it in there, you're just surprised with the cloud of dirt and dust that just pops out. But generally, as always, as I've recommended in every single video, pull it out at least once a month. If you're not painting or working any projects, spray a few fine lines like I did in this video, pull it apart, put it back together, and your skills will improve gradually and get better as you apply on projects and test projects, and not stagnate, or worse, lose confidence and stop working. There's lots of content out there, as well as I'm in contact through private message as well as the comment section. Have fun and happy modeling. Catch you guys next time.